You're tuned into 9 to 5 Work Rebels with your host, Ebony Gale.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Gems in Comms series special, brought to you by 9 to 5 Work Rebels in association with Hanson Search, the award-winning international exec search consultancy. I am your host, Ebony Gale, and I am super, super happy and excited to be speaking with the lovely Effie Kanyua, and she is the former director of PR and comms at Hearst UK. So for those of you who don't know Hearst is a massive publications company, and they have publications such as Elle Magazine, Women's Health, Red Magazine. They have a host of wonderful magazines that are very popular, and I'm sure you've heard of many of them. Welcome, Effie.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Lovely to meet you. Lovely to have you on. And thank you for joining us here. So the whole reason for this podcast is all about highlighting people of colour, particularly women at the moment I'm doing, of colour within the PR and communications industry. Because we know it is quite a dominantly white industry. It's actually 91% white. And but of course, there are people of colour within the industry doing some great things. And there's a lot of initiatives that are happening in the industry as well to try and help change this trajectory. Now, this podcast is all about giving you your flowers. So we want to say, a big welcome to you and a well done to you for trailblazing within the PR and comms, sector. You've managed to, get some great highs within the industry. And I think it's great. And it's, it's important that we are able to give you your flowers. So again, a very big congratulations to you. Okay. And I want to start off our first question by asking you to tell us about yourself and what you do or what you did.
So my previous role was working as director of PR and comms at Hearst UK. I think you mentioned some of the titles like Cosmopolitan, Harper's Bazaar, Elle, etc. But it's not the first time that I actually worked in publishing. I was the former communications director at Bauer Media. So I also worked on the magazines division. So for publications such as Grazia and Empire magazine, which I'm a huge fan of still, but also on the radio side of things. So for radio stations such as Kiss and Magic and Absolute Radio. So, I've kind of worked in the sort of publishing media sector for quite a long time. And I actually started off my career at the BBC as a journalist. So I didn't actually start off in PR, but I've pretty much, I think throughout my career, I've worked agency side as well as in-house. And I've pretty much done everything. So FMCG and tech, we were just talking a little bit earlier, but I'm currently in Germany. And I remember there was a point in my career when I was consulting with startups in Berlin. So I've always had a massive passion for tech. But, I've worked on everything from sort of Marmite to consumer health, like toothpaste. And then, the other side of the spectrum, working in media. And, it's been sort of great and interesting, but I didn't actually think, or I didn't start off thinking that I was going to work in PR. I kind of fell into it by accident, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. It does. And there's a lot of people that kind of come into PR via journalism route. I actually just interviewed Evangeline Campbell. I don't know if you know her, but she was also ex-BBC. But she's PR as well. So it's interesting the routes that we get in there. But, there's something about the industry that attracts us, even from the journalistic perspective. Very interesting.
And it kind of makes sense, though. I mean, if you think about a comms expert, it's all about telling stories.
Absolutely.
And being able to sell your brand or communicate your brand to media and speak to consumers. And if you come from a journalistic background, then I think the one thing that you have is that training of how to tell good stories.
Absolutely.
And having that, I guess, really sort of helps you think through your strategy in terms of, what is it that I'm trying to do for my brand or brands in our case, and it just causes you to think a different way. And that's the thing. I think a lot of the journalists that I've dealt with over the years, we all kind of started off, at a lower level and have worked our way up. So a lot of the people that I started with and were my first contacts are now sort of, big editors at, lots of publications. And that's really nice because you have that sort of understanding and respect.
Absolutely. And that helps you too with sending in the stories and the building relationship for all your brands, which is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So that's interesting because I was going to say what attracted you to the industry, but it's the storytelling side, isn't it? It's the whole communication and the communicating effectively, as you just mentioned. So I want to touch on, of course, lived experiences, because I think that's quite an important aspect to share. So one of the questions I always ask all my people I'm interviewing, which is, when did you become aware of your ethnicity? Now, this may seem strange to others, but for us, it shouldn't be. I feel like whilst you're born in the skin you are in, you don't become necessarily aware of some of the nuances or the differences or the prejudices until you maybe enter the workplace or enter school. For me, it was entering school, secondary school to be specific. And I remember hearing about a group of guys, or thugs, I should say, who would go around and pick out, people of colour in particular, and they would use blades to cut into their face. And they were called the Chelsea Smilers, I was told about. And I remember hearing about that and being petrified going to school, just thinking, oh my God, these people could potentially come and attack me just because of the skin that I've been born into. So for you, when was your kind of moment?
I mean, I think, to be honest, it was similar in terms of school age. But I think the reason why it was a bit more pronounced for me was I actually won a scholarship to go to a boarding school. And the boarding school in question, I don't know, there were about 900 pupils. It was a boarding school. I think there were maybe 5 Black people in the school. So it was really noticeable. And, I experienced really severe bullying whilst I was there. And I was acutely aware, and, everything from, it was horrible, from teachers to pupils, and, the sorts of insults that I think about, now, it wouldn't be allowed to happen, but I would have to endure on a daily basis. And my poor mum was, had to come to the school a few times to have words because the thing was so severe. And it's not to say, if I could go back, it was the best education. I really genuinely believe that I wouldn't be in the position that I am now. And I think, that's important. You don't see that many Black communications directors and
Absolutely.
At that level. And I think having had that experience at such an early age and the good education, because, that's why I went there, because I wanted to have the best education. I couldn't afford to pay for it, so I had to be the scholarship kid. But if I hadn't had that, then, I wouldn't be where I am. So I'm always forever grateful and the friendships I made. But it was tough. I mean, it was really tough, brutal.
I can only imagine. That is quite, something. Absolutely, you should write a book about that in itself. I'm sure it'd be very insightful.
It would be a bit traumatic.
And traumatic, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, but can you imagine the amount of girls that are going to boarding schools now? Even though it's changing slightly, but it's still not that. It's not that skewed that differently. I know someone who went off to boarding school and she had a few issues as well. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I suppose the next question would be about it. Experiencing it in the workplace. So have you felt like your race, ethnicity has held you back within your career?
100%. I mean, I think it's kind of disingenuous for anyone to think, and that's why I always find it interesting when people say, oh, racism doesn't exist and it's so much better. You can't really say that unless you've been through that lived experience.
Exactly.
And, I think definitely in PR and comms, it's getting better, has got better, but it still exists. And, I mentor a lot of people. I'm part of various sort of mentoring schemes. I was just chatting to someone today, and I'm going to do the Women in PR scheme again. But at Hearst, we actually launched our own mentoring scheme for people who wanted to get particularly into sort of media and luxury. And I think in the luxury beauty industry and those sorts of industries, I think it's even tougher. I think there are some other sectors where it's a lot more open. I think for me, I noticed it as a challenge. I mean, the thing that I will forever be grateful for will be to Bauer Media, because they offered me that role as a communications director when there weren't people who looked at like me
like you in that level,
at a major media company, and like that's the big deal for me to sort of be one of the first Black communications directors. Like, it's a big thing, and
that is massive.
And I take a sort of a lot, and that's why I try and do as much mentoring and try and be an advocate, because for me, it was kind of quite scary. I'm forever grateful, but the whole thing was that there just weren't people like me that I could look up to or see around me. Absolutely. And it's challenging going into sectors or organizations where there isn't representation. And, even going to Hearst, I sat on the senior leadership team. And again, I was the only Black woman on the senior leadership team. And again, that's, quite a sort of daunting thing to go into. So, I think it's really important for all organizations. I think a lot was said after BLM. I'm kind of still, slightly skeptical if things have
actually changed. Absolutely.
Yeah, just speaking to people and like even my own personal experiences, racism exists. Like,
absolutely.
Excluded from jobs.
Yeah.
I remember someone once telling me that, as a white male, you'll be promoted or may get a job based on potential. But if you're a Black woman in particular, and it's gender as well as ethnicity, you almost have to be doubly qualified. And I think that's one thing I've always felt, that you have to work 10 times harder, and you take it on board because that's the norm.
Yeah.
But why should it be the norm that you have to be twice as good to even get a look in? And, there have been instances where I've been fully qualified for a role. And this particularly happens in the luxury and sort of beauty industry, fully qualified for a role, the complete skill set, and they wouldn't even give me a look in. And that's sad, and it's still happening in the present day. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and I'm always kind of quite skeptical of brands that they make all of these sort of
claims. Absolutely, promises and claims, and you think, well, the proof is in the pudding.
I know the other side. And for that reason, I've always been sort of quite particular about who I will and won't work for. And I can say that there are definite brands that, based on my experience or the experience I've heard from others, I wouldn't feel comfortable working for, because I know that they are not diverse or anti-racist companies. I think that's important. You have to go where you're wanted. Absolutely.
You go where you're celebrated and not tolerated. Absolutely agree with you on that. Absolutely. No, thank you for sharing that. So when I asked you about the racism, that so you believe that it does hold you back, and that's very true. I'm definitely with you on that. So would you say you've experienced or witnessed racism in the workplace, and how was it handled?
Yeah, I mean, I guess throughout my career, I've seen it in sort of, various different scenarios, both agency side and in-house. And I don't know. I mean, do you say one's worse than the other? Sorry to cut you, because I find it interesting. A lot of people say that agencies are worse than in-house, but I think it depends where you're working in-house. No, I mean, I sort of disagree with that, because I've seen it sort of both sides. And having worked in-house probably as much now as I've worked agency side, it happens everywhere. And it's got nothing to do with, like where it is. It's to do with the company and the culture. And, I think you could have two different companies that say are two tech companies, and one would have a culture that's very, very inclusive. And then you could have another one where actually it's not. And so it's, I think it starts from the top, and it starts on the sort of values that a business has and the type of culture, but also, I guess, how businesses deal with racism. So I guess, if there's a culture where it's felt that it's acceptable to be racist or not tolerate, people based on ethnicity or religion or sexuality or whatever, if that's the norm, then people feel free to do it. But if, there's a sort of zero tolerance policy, then I think it's much harder to do. Or even more than that, if steps and measures are taken to, deal with in an appropriate manner people that do it, then it doesn't happen. But, you know, I like I said, I mentor, I've got sort of lots of peers that I kind of started with right at the beginning, and just seeing some of their experiences. Like a lot of my Black friends freelance because they couldn't get permanent positions.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's the thing that you have to think about. Recruiters wouldn't take them on their books. They wouldn't be put forward for jobs. They wouldn't get the interviews, or they wouldn't get the jobs. And, you know, I found a lot of friends will be kept in, say, you know, an AM position or an AD position for a significant amount of time, whereas people who are less experienced would be promoted through the ranks. So those are the sort of things, that's how kind of, you know, things manifest, I guess, just at the very base level. And then it kind of goes through the whole spectrum to sort of workplace bullying and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So, you know, it's there in existence, you know, within agencies, you know, in-house, across the board. And it's pretty much up to the businesses, you know, to, I guess, recognize that it's there and then find ways to sort of get rid of it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've had this conversation just before I spoke with you as well. And so the same thing, it's literally about the top-down approach. And it is a case of, you know, if you've got somebody who's no tolerant at the top, then that will kind of ricochet down and help the company culture. But if you've got a culture of not acknowledging it, or even gaslighting when it is happening, and, you know, or it's not really happening, you know, it's like, well, you won't get it. Something that's the thing I find really interesting about the UK as well, because our racism is quite covert. It's not overt racism. So you've got microaggressions, you know, you don't necessarily get called names. You won't get told, you know, you're the N-word or your smell or whatever, but it might be something a bit more like, you know, well, they assume that you're lower than you are. And, you know, there's lots of different microaggressions that can happen. So again, like you said, it is about top down. I believe that, you know, in terms of changing culture, it is down to those that are leading. And again, for you to even mention about the freelancing, again, another true point. There's a lot of people that I know who've turned to freelancing, because they're not necessarily was happy where they were because of racism. And then once they are doing that, like you say, there's issues around, you know, going for roles and how they even kind of find their way around that in itself is another kind of sticking block. Very interesting.
But I think that's one thing in our industry, like a lot of people I knew, and like I said, like you've given the stats, as that there are Black people who work in comms, and there are talented Black people who work in comms. But I felt like I knew quite a lot of the people that did work in comms, and everyone had the same experience where they just wouldn't get the roles that they wanted to. And so I guess freelancing, I mean, I worked as a freelancer and I consulted quite a bit, but I had a specific mindset because I was trying to save up to buy a house at the time. And so in terms of, I guess, you know, getting a better rate as opposed to on a contract, that was very much a conscious decision, and that was my decision. But I know people who did it just because they, you know, couldn't necessarily get those permanent roles. They'd be taken on as a freelancer, but they wouldn't actually be taken on permanently. You know, and that to me is just like it's all kinds of wrong, because there's so much talent within the industry.
Absolutely.
Which is why when businesses say, "Oh,
there's no talent," it's like, you're not really looking. There are talent. I mean, like we are here. There are, like you said, it's 90s. I said it's 91% white, but there's still that percentage that are here. You know, we are still here. So no, I completely get it. I get that. So when it does come to racism, has there been a time within the workplace where you've maybe spoken up or wish you spoke up about something? You know, a time when you kind of self-advocated or maybe advocated for somebody else?
I mean, to be honest, I think most people who know me know that I'm pretty outspoken, and I feel, like I said, I feel a bit of a responsibility being in the position that I am. I mean, it's tricky because, you know, when you are so outspoken, it doesn't do you any favors.
Be a target,
but to be honest, you know, that's not really, not to be able to speak up for what's right or wrong, and to speak up when no one else is speaking up is something that I just don't think you can be scared of. And so I've done it, and, you know, I've done it to my detriment, but I've done it just because I think it depends how you feel as a person. And, you know, I know people who have been in a sort of similar scenario who have been Black people as well, who've seen something, known something, and haven't spoken up. And I have spoken up and said it's wrong. And I believe that, you know, this is racism and da-da-da-da-da. And it, you know, it's a difficult thing to do because you're always scared of sort of repercussions, etc. But I think to do it. And I think speaking up is really important. It's kind of scary, but I think, you know, people do need to speak up. Also, sometimes you need to speak up just because I think there is, you know, racism that is very deliberate and very planned and knowing, but sometimes there are things that happen where people actually don't even realize what they're doing. And so it's almost a form of education, and it's saying that this is a boundary, it's been crossed, you shouldn't do it. And then people know and they're educated, whether or not they pay attention to it, it's whatever. But I think there is, you know, there are two different scenarios. There's a sort of very deliberate racism that happens that you can't, I think that's why I always find it funny when people do, you know, all of this unconscious bias training, stuff, whatever. If, you know, if you're racist, you're racist. So like nothing, you can do as many courses as you want. It's not going to change that. The only thing I think will change is if there are measures in place to mean that if you do act out on those beliefs and behaviours, you know
there's some sort of repercussion. Absolutely.
That's the only way to deal with that. But then there are sometimes things that people do that's very unknowing, and that is just through being told, actually, this isn't acceptable. And the education piece. And I think that's the difference between sort of people who learn and actually think, gosh, wow, I want to do better, move on. And then, you know, the others that don't want to, they'll just carry on it.
They'll carry on or fall away at the side somewhere. You know, those are the ones that I will hope will get caught up, you know, like when you see on social media and they report someone who's racist at work and you think, well, hopefully they'll get hit in their pocket because that's the only way they might learn about their racist outbursts. You know,
you'd be surprised. I mean, you'd be surprised at how many people get away with it, which is why I think it's 100%. It has to be top down, and it's down to sort of company culture. And I think it's also down to businesses, you know, wanting to deal with issues like that. So if you're aware that something's happened, you know, deal with it head on and make people aware that it's not acceptable. And I think, you know, if more businesses did that, then you'd probably see a lot less being visible and, you know, people having to experience it. It's not that you take away the problem. It means that people don't act out on those beliefs. And that's the difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you. I absolutely. Imagine if everyone did take it on board, it'd be just a better place. So yeah, absolutely. Again, another question I'm really keen to get your opinion on is about code switching. And whether you feel that, you know, people of colour can ever lead with their authentic voice in the workplace. Because I don't think we can, honestly. I feel like there's always going to be an element of code switching.
I think, you know, that there's still an issue where I think as a Black person, you know, definitely as a Black woman, I don't know how you feel. You're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. You know, if you speak up and say something, then you're always worried that you'll be, you know, labelled as, I've asked every Black female I know if they've ever been labelled as aggressive, and every single one has. And like, I know these people and they're not.
Yeah, they're not.
And so when you speak up, or if you assert your authority because you're a manager or whatever it is in the workplace, then you're automatically aggressive. But if it's white male, then he's just assertive.
He's assertive. Absolutely.
And so I think it is, you know, there's a fine line, you know, between sort of being your authentic self and actually being able to work within a corporate environment. So can you 100% be yourself? I think, you know, businesses that say you can bring your authentic self to work, I think that's fine if you're of a certain race. I think if you're potentially Black or a Black female, I don't think you can. And I think, you know, it's just one of the things that you learn the more businesses you work within. you know, as you sort of grow and mature, it's the same way that if you go into the workplace and you speak to your colleagues, it's not the same way that you would speak to your family or you speak to your friends. So you just need to learn how to compartmentalize how you portray yourself at work, and the way that you speak and act and conduct yourself in a working environment should be completely different from how you would conduct yourself with your friends and family. So whilst, you know, it feels as though you're not 100% being yourself, I think you can be yourself, but you bring elements of yourself forward and you sort of dial other elements of yourself back because it's not appropriate for the setting.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I agree. But I feel like there's an element of that which I find really unfair, which is, again, the white counterparts can really bring themselves to work as themselves quite a lot. Maybe not totally, you know, full on out, but pretty much they can. Whereas, but, you know, for Black people, it's not quite the same. So yes, completely get it. And we've been conditioned that way anyway, because think about it, when we get to school, when we go to college, go through your first job, you always know, you know, to put on your sort of work voice or to put on your work side. And then, you know, you go home, you're a bit more relaxed a bit. So I feel like it's something that we inherently know, hence why we call it code switching. I spoke to someone recently and she was saying, she's a bit older, so she was saying, actually, it wasn't called code switching in her time, but it's something that we've always had to do, because you have to get into the workplace. You've got to be able to kind of, you know, make your way within the ranks and almost stay in your lane to a degree without being too, you know, authentic. As much as they do, like you say, a lot of employers say bring an authentic voice to work, but for us, it's a case of don't always feel like you can do that, because like you said, if you speak up about something, it can be labeled as aggressive. And this drives me mad too, the stereotypes, you know. It was really interesting. I spoke to a colleague of mine, someone else I interviewed. Now, her background is Chinese. So she spoke about being able to lean into her stereotypes, because I said, but that's because Chinese have always had very favorable stereotypes, and their team has the kind of favorable ethnic, you know, group to kind of, you know, assimilate with. Now, she spoke about being seen as a tiger mom and how she was able to kind of lean into that. Whereas I said to her, that's interesting, but for Black women, we don't want to lean into angry Black women tropes. Or, you know, for example, I flagged the fact that the Black Communications Network survey that they did a couple of years ago flagged that a lot of people who were around agency tables with clients or, you know, going through to meetings were being mistaken for toilet attendants and cleaners. Because simply, exactly. Gosh. And it's like, because of the color of your skin, I'm like, that's not something we're going to want to lean into, you know. So it depends on the stereotype. But I found it interesting to think that, you know, some people can lean into stereotypes, whereas for us, we're like, no, we want to repeal it, you know. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. And sorry, just coming back to that, you know, I was thinking of, you know, something that I know quite a few people have experienced. Also, sometimes, you know, working agency side, you've had clients who would not want you working on their brand purely because you are Black. Like they would feel more comfortable. It happened to me. It happened, you know, to quite a few people I know, that by being the Black person, you know, working on or leading the account,
they didn't want it.
You know, the client wouldn't feel comfortable unless there was, you know, a white person leading the account. And, you know, that's just unforgivable. But, you know, it's happened to
it happens, though. It happens. I hear about that quite often. And what was that? Luxury again? Is that like luxury industry?
No, it's actually tech.
It was tech?
Yeah, no,
interesting.
But I mean, it's happened, and you know, it was devastating because I was the most qualified person to lead that account.
Yeah,
and so I was taken off the account at the request of that client, and that's racism, right? And so the agency didn't do anything about it. But you know, it's like it happened to so many people I know. The more conversations you have, the more you hear about it, and it's. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy, but, you know, that's kind of what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's interesting you mentioned that as well, because there's an article out today, I think, in The Guardian about tech and racism for Black people in tech at the moment, and how high that is as well. You know, so it's interesting as a tech client.
And I think, sorry, that just to say, the problem with tech is that I think people always think that because it's like, kind of, with startups and newer technologies, I think they always think that it will be a more tolerant environment. But if you look at the sort of top percent of who the people at the very, very top, you will still find that it's very much white male dominated. And so actually, I think tech is, one of those places where unless you start seeing at sort of the big brands, people in, senior positions that are, people who are Black or, female, Black, etc. across the board, and then you will still continue to get those problems because nothing changes at the top. It comes from the top because that's where you have the real influence and power. And so I always think there's a sort of misconception that people think that certain industries will be easier. It only gets easier when there is representation, and that's why it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you. So what's your, when did you become aware of the sort of colour bias in PR and comms? You know that straight away? Or was it like your agency experience that you started to see it? Or was it just over the years?
So for me, I think it was when I was based in Manchester and I moved down to London. And I think the first kind of port of call was recruiters who wouldn't even take my CV.
Oh, wow.
And then recruiters who wouldn't put forward for jobs and etc. So I think, that's another, I know a lot of recruiters have done a lot of work at trying to address it. But, something that I did at Hearst was we had some roles that were open and we asked a particular agency to send forward CVs and to send forward diverse CVs, and they couldn't find any diverse CVs.
Wow.
Because you're not looking. So we actually ended up using another agency, which lo and behold was able to find
some diverse CVs
across the board. But a lot of my friends who started with me sort of around the same time experienced the same issues where recruiters, it's at the time where a lot of recruiters would bring their sort of friends in, and people would have their favorites and you couldn't even register on their books, but they wouldn't even put you forward for the jobs. And I experienced a lot of that. And it, it's really disheartening because you have to pay your bills, as much as
just like everybody else. Absolutely.
But you just weren't getting the opportunity. So it wasn't necessarily, and that's not even before you've got to the step of going for the interview, which is another barrier in itself, where you've got to sort of prove that you're more than capable for the job. You just weren't getting the opening. So that, to me, I think at the start of my career was, the sort of biggest hurdle, just even being able to get registered with agencies. But then I kind of got to the point where I had, I built up my CV where I had so much experience where actually recruiters would want to sign me up and would always put me forward for jobs because I would always get the jobs. The interview, I would get the job, not in an arrogant way, but because my CV was qualified. So strong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was more than qualified. And so that kind of changed things for me, but it just wasn't the same for everyone else.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I get that as well, because I've got friends who I speak to and, you start to compare stories as you do, don't you? So no, I get that. But I do feel like there's some recruiters that are doing a lot more, trying to do a lot more within that area. Sure. And it's always interesting because I feel like they have to also push back on their clients because they got clients who are saying, red brick only universities or only certain ones. And you think, well, even when they say red brick, it's like, well, okay, fine. But don't think that people of colour don't actually go to these universities as well. It's just like, it's not just a red brick doesn't mean that it's solely white. There are people getting in there, but obviously not to the amount that are in some other universities. But again, an issue.
I think recruiters are really good. So, I mean, you mentioned Hanson Search, who I've kind of done panel talks with them, and I've worked with them over the years. And there's lots of recruiters, independent recruiters, that I think have done amazing work. I think where actually you find the biggest issues is when you go in-house. Right. And so I guess from my experience, it's not actually the recruiters, it's the internal recruitment teams. They won't even actively search for people of colour to bring in. Or if you contact them, they will ghost you. Like speaking to all of my mentees, the biggest, single thing that links an experience as a Black person is being ghosted by recruiters, and particularly recruiters who work in-house. I've had it happen to me. I know my mentees are, and they just won't respond to you, and they won't give you the fair sort of level of respect that they would give to a person who is white. And I think that's a problem that still needs to be addressed. So I don't think it's the independent recruiters. I think they've done so much work over the years. I think they're the ones that are actually sort of driving change.
Yes.
The real issue comes from the big brands that have their in-house teams who aren't held accountable and don't proactively try and make a difference.
That's a good point. That is a very good point, because I feel like recruiters do get quite a bad rap in terms of being seen as that. And I, like you said, I've worked with Hanson Search, and I know they're doing quite a lot to change that and driving things forward. But again, when it comes to in-house, they're kind of Lawrence themselves, aren't they? So essentially, they can pick and choose. Whereas I feel like recruiters are a bit more out in the open. So you might be open to more scrutiny. Whereas when you're in-house, you just kind of get along with it, you chug along. And unless you're being challenged to actually really source people, you'll find that you're going to keep replacing like for like.
And that's what happens. That's why if you look at a lot, and I guess from my perspective, I always look at senior leadership teams and people at the very top. If you look at a lot of brands, it doesn't matter what they're saying in terms of their diversity policy. If considering BLM and everything that's happened over the past few years.
George Floyd. Absolutely.
If you still look at their senior leadership teams and everything else, and if there hasn't been a change there, then they haven't made a change. I think that's
the crux of it, isn't it? Absolutely. And I feel like a lot of people are looking now and wanting to see what's happening. What you said all this stuff. We had all these black squares going on. So what has changed? A lot of it is lip service. And I feel like a lot of companies just jumped on it for PR, 100%. And now it's showing that actually, was it real? Or was it just performative?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you can just compare the companies that I think you can see is, the companies that are doing ethnicity pay gaps and are being transparent about that. That have brought in talent. And it's not saying that you're hiring people just for the sake of hiring, but you're actually doing the work to find people, to make sure that you are interviewing people across the spectrum. And so to me, the companies, and, I remember seeing sort of on various social media platforms, people comparing, and there are brands who have made, absolute changes. And so I think there has been a lot of work, but then I think there are a lot of brands that jumped on the bandwagon and nothing's changed. I think that's really poor. I mean, I would say I actually have had I was saying that tech can be bad, but actually, I've had a really, I guess, a pleasant experience in terms of tech companies proactively approaching me in terms of trying to bring me, into the business, because they're doing the hard work to search you out. And I think that's the important thing. But then, in the luxury and beauty sector, I think that's shocking. They have no desire.
They're not. They're not. I see that mostly as white girl PR, to be quite open and honest. It sounds bad, but it's just quite true. And in certain aspects of fashion as well, they just look at it as, okay, it must be a white girl to do it. A white lady has to do the PR. It's like, well, why? You think that we don't care about beauty? Or we don't care about fashion? Or it's really interesting, like you say. It's very, in certain industries, like you say, you see it more than others. But I think beauty is a very interesting one indeed, because a lot of people that I know who work in the beauty side are not necessarily of colour.
Yeah, and what is it's so weird is that if you think about Fenty and its success and being $1 billion,
who made it so big? It's all black
and
celebrities.
And Pat McGrath and all of those beauty brands that are inclusive. I think like a friend of mine, Lydia Moa, who does the Black Pound report, she's proven the value of the Black Pound, and just how important it is to cater your products and to be diverse. It's not to do people a favor.
Right. It's just business sense.
it just makes good.
It makes business sense. I mean, I did my dissertation on this many moons ago, and I did it around beauty because I didn't want to go into beauty side of things. But what I was showing was the amount of money that Black women spend on beauty and hair. Even my course director was shocked when I'd done all the stats and put that forward. And they were like, wow, the industry definitely needs to be putting more money towards advertising it towards Black consumers because you guys have got a lot of money spent in that area. Absolutely. It was around hair as well. We like to make sure our hair is looking great. So we look good. And I just don't think it's valuing our Black pound enough. And I think when people realise that, then, you can open it all up.
But what I think has happened is that brands have become more diverse because they've seen, the sort of Fenty effect and what it does in terms of bringing revenue. I think the place where I have an issue is that they do it externally because it's like a capital sort of, revenue stream that they want to bring in. But what they're not doing is working within their own
organizations.
To change. And I think some of the worst stories that you've heard of sort of racism in the past couple of years have been from sort of those brands, particularly within, I think, beauty and luxury. Which are still just not as diverse as they should be. And
Absolutely.
There's kind of no excuse.
There is no excuse. There's no excuse. And when you look at it and break it really down, so something like Fenty, I mean, who helped to boost their sales? Nicki Minaj. You've got all these artists that are out here, Black artists that are wearing designers, helping to sell products left, right, and centre. You've got people who are now cutting on now and now doing, great deals with these people. But again, it's still outside, it's still surface, it's not necessarily internal. So again, like you said, there needs to be work. There's more work to be done in those areas for sure.
Or it needs to be Black-owned businesses. So Rihanna with Fenty, Pat McGrath with her own sort of standalone brand. I didn't
even say Fenty. I meant to say not Fenty.
Rihanna.
I meant to say Rihanna. Yes, sorry. But then I was also thinking of the fashion brand. It wasn't that. It was not Fenty. What's the other one? The other F brand, but Fendi. Sorry, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking of Fendi with Nicki Minaj. She blew them up. Fendi, obviously, is Black owned, we know, but I was mixing those two.
But I think that's sometimes what's needed is to have those brands where you have, someone who starts the business who it comes in at the most senior level and they can sort of build the teams. Just because I think otherwise it's kind of very, very difficult for people to kind of get into that. I always say to my mentees when they talk about sort of like what are the trickiest industries to get into, beauty, luxury and media, I would say like the most challenging ones, which are the industries that I work in. So I kind of know firsthand. And that's where, the representation still needs kind of like a lot more work.
Definitely. Do you ever hear that story about Beyonce where she got her agency involved and they didn't go with the agency because there were no Black staff on there? And I always loved that story. And I thought, well, good, this is what they need to happen. And this needs to happen more and more from particularly Black artists and those Black business owners demand more so that you can get the change. And those white owners too. Like if you are pro diversity, you should be asking for your teams to be diverse because then the agency will then have to go and do their due diligence,
that's what real allyship is. I mean, I think...
Absolutely. That's my next question as well, your thoughts on allyship. So perfect segue.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people think that allyship is about, putting a few posts up, attending a few courses and reading books and educating yourself. That's not allyship. Allyship is unfortunately having to do the hard work. So when you see something that isn't right, that's happening right in front of you, instead of leaving it to the Black person to speaking up from your place of privilege.
Yeah.
And I think that's in it. It's really interesting. I actually remember being in a scenario where myself and another Black person had said something to someone about, something to do with diversity, et cetera. And it wasn't until a white person said exactly the same thing that we'd said that this person took it seriously. And that's what allyship is that speaking up. It's not about, it's not about the posting or the understanding or whatever. It's about being uncomfortable and doing what's right, because you are in a better position, in a more privileged position to use your voice so that people can take you seriously. Absolutely. It's a lot more challenging as a Black person to be able to communicate. It's not that you're not a good communicator, but there'll always be a stereotype when you speak up, like, you're being too sensitive or whatever. But when it comes from a white person saying, actually, this doesn't feel right, you shouldn't be doing this, it's actually taken seriously, because there is that sense of commonality between those two people. Well, actually, if this person is saying it, then maybe there is something.
There's some truth.
Whereas if it's a Black person saying it, then it's not always taken as seriously. So that's what I think real allyship is. Yeah. And that's what needs to happen. And I think, people have thought that allyship is merely, kind of educating themselves. That's not real allyship. No. Allyship is about getting as uncomfortable as the thing that you see is wrong or, is occurring, and putting yourself in a position where you use your position of privilege.
Absolutely. And you've articulated that perfectly. Exactly that. And that was my question, was your thoughts on it. What does it mean to you? And you said it clearly. And I agree. I completely agree. I feel like people misinterpret what it is. And I feel like another person I interviewed said something that was really good. And she said it's also about what is said about you when you're out, when you're not in the room. That's also your allyship. Are you advocating for your people while they're out of the room? Or are you just, joining in with the banter? It's very interesting.
Yeah. And you know what? I totally get it, because it is really hard. Like I felt it myself when everyone has thought one thing and I've had to speak up and have said, actually, this isn't right, and no one else agrees with me. It's scary, it's daunting, and it's challenging, and it's really daunting, and you don't want to become the victim. So I get how challenging it is, but it's how you feel as a person and your ethics and morals as to whether or not you'll speak up for the right thing or not, or whether you will stay silent. And I just think, if you know that something's happening and it's not right and you don't speak up, well, you're just as culpable as the people.
You're kind of part of the problem, aren't you? Yeah, absolutely. It's either you're sort of, you're either creating the change, or, you're being part of the change, or you're not, it's like, or you're
perpetuating it.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, I get that. Absolutely. So you've spoken a bit about your career as well. So what motivates you, or what inspires you to keep going, in the face of, challenges that we face within the workplace?
I think, to be in the comms industry, you have to actually enjoy it. And I do really enjoy working in comms. So I think having that love and that passion is kind of what motivates me. But then I also think I come from a sort of African background where you have that ethic, that really strong ethic where you have to prove yourself, being the best, that's what your family expects of you. And so I think, I always had that overachiever gene in me from an early age. And so I've always wanted to be the best. And, I'm not ashamed about that. I always knew from an early age that I wanted to do well, whether, going to sort of a school or a university or doing well in my career. And, something like the BBC, I tried for about a year or two to get in there. So I was really, really persistent. So I've always been really driven. I've always been really ambitious. And I always want to be the best, that I can possibly be. And definitely, I guess in the past couple of years, my team won multiple awards for being sort of best in-house team and various campaigns and stuff. Yeah. And that's always been a motivating sort of thing for me, that, I always want to work in teams that do well. And I always want to push myself as well. I want to be the best that I can possibly be. But then I also want to, I guess, in terms of a representative point of view, I want to be at the very top of my career because I want other people who are coming into this industry to actually realize that you can make it. Because if you don't see people who look like you at the top, then what's the incentive to come in? And so I've always taken, since I sort of started to move up the ranks, that's why I probably do speak as much as I do and get involved in mentoring and stuff. I take being in a sort of position where I'm able to really seriously. And I do want to see more people in positions of leadership, for sure.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Absolutely. And what would you say you found most challenging on your career journey so far?
Being a Black woman.
We can't change that. Okay, we are melanated and wonderful.
Yeah, I think the thing about comms is that that's why I was saying it's really important to love what you do. Comms is a challenging industry to be in. Like, you work long hours. It's really fast paced. There's lots of challenges. Especially if you have to deal with things like crisis comms, pandemic, that has kind of like been my staple for the past few years.
Yeah.
So you need to have a sort of amount of resilience,
absolutely,
to be able to work through it. So, I would never have it any other way. I mean, I wish there were times when things would be easier, but ultimately I love it. What I do. And so
that's great.
As long as I can keep doing it and being good at it, I'll carry on doing it.
No, that's brilliant. And then I suppose what I want to ask you, especially with this hat on of us, think of we're Black women in the workplace. For you, what do you want from your employer? What makes a good working environment for you?
Yeah, I mean, actually, interestingly, I think things have very much changed. I think with everything that's happened, I think looking at culture first, I think for me, it's not just the role. So it's not just working for a great brand. It's not just, the role or the prestige. It's about the environment that you're going into. And so for me, it's an environment or a business or a workplace that is doing hard work. It's not to say that place is perfect, but it's actually having, a business or a place that has really strong values and is prepared to do the hard work that's necessary to make their environment inclusive and a welcome place for people across the whole spectrum. It's not just about ethnicity, but it's across the whole spectrum. And just because I really genuinely believe that diverse workforces are kind of, just a more productive and a nicer place to work. And so there's also, a part of me that thinks that sometimes I want to go into spaces where there is no representation, because I almost want to prove a point that we need to get in so that we can, start changing and educating people. So I think there's a matter of that. But just from a comfort level, you always want to go into a business where you feel that you'll be welcomed. I would never now, like going into a business, if I knew that it wasn't a tolerant, workplace or an inclusive workplace or a business that was taking diversity seriously, then I wouldn't want to work there. And so it's having a business that puts its people first, that thinks about things like mental health, flexibility, understands the complexities of people in different scenarios, whether they're parents or caregivers or whatever it is. It's that type of work environment that I think, because you spend most of your life there, that I think makes the perfect work environment.
I completely agree. I think that's absolutely right. I was going to say, what does diversity look like to you? But it's like what you just saying, an environment that's welcoming, isn't it, to all?
Yeah.
So I get it. I think that's interesting as well, and good points. I agree. That's the kind of the workplace most people want to be in, right? You want to be appreciated, you want to be valued, you want to feel like everyone's welcome, everyone's accepted, and that they're working towards changing things and being progressive. Sounds great. And so again, we're going to touch, because we're getting towards wrapping up of it now, but I want to pick up as one of your proudest moments before we're going to touch on a little bit of the mindset. But So proudest moments. Can you tell us about your proudest moments of your work? It could be work, it could be personal, like a career highlight.
I mean, proudest moments are definitely all of the awards that my team won at Hearst. Plus, I was actually in London not so long ago for the PR Week Power Book event. It was like my first event, going God knows how long, but that was my 4th year in a row. And again, I think it's kind of important to see sort of more and more Black faces being included in things like Power Lists. It was the fact that my team just went from strength to strength, from a team that never won any awards to winning multiple awards in the time that was there. And, that's a massive achievement.
That's a massive achievement.
We were just going from strength to strength and winning for our hard work on our campaigns, but also what we did as a team as a whole. So I think professionally, those have kind of been my proudest moments, just because, it's almost like getting that recognition for all the hard work. Because I know all of the hard work that we put in behind the scenes and the long hours and, the stress. And so, that to me was particularly at a time during a pandemic, when things had been pretty tough. Those were kind of I guess, the real sort of career highlights for me.
No,
I think, obviously the time that I first joined Bauer was amazing as well. It was a bit of a sort of statement for me. And then just from a sort of personal perspective, being able to do things like working remotely or moving to Germany and stuff like that. I just think it's sometimes really important for everyone to just, take a leap of faith and do something that, maybe not everyone will agree with, or people won't think that you'll be able to do, and just to make a real go of it.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I don't know. I don't think I've ever really had many regrets. And I think the one thing that I've learned about myself is that I'm constantly pushing myself forward, and it's just more important to kind of be happy with what you're doing and feel proud of yourself. It's not about proving yourself externally, it's about how you feel as a person.
I get it. I agree with you completely on that. And what are your thoughts on the industry and how you think it will evolve over the next few years?
I mean,
that's in general, it's both in general.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I've been doing a lot of judging recently, PRCA and PR Moments, etc., CIPR. I've seen a lot of changes. Particularly from an agency side, there are lots of amazing agencies out there that are doing great work. And I think agencies have definitely taken the whole diversity thing on board. And agencies are focusing on, putting their people first and focusing on things that are important. And that's what I think is really important. And so, when I look at agencies like Manifest and Ketchum and all of the sort of amazing work that they do the work that, the reason why I love them as agencies is that they probably invest where they don't have to.
Yeah, absolutely. They definitely do invest where they don't have to.
But they do it because they want to. That's the thing. Some of this takes real investment and time and commitment. It's not necessarily, it's not going to hit your sort of bottom line in terms of bringing in revenue, but it's the right thing to do. And so, for me, seeing lots of agencies like that are sort of, thinking about those types of things and, being sort of real trailblazers, I just think it's absolutely amazing. So I think there's kind of lots of exciting stuff happening in the industry. Purely from an in-house perspective, I would just love to see some of that ethos and mentality kind of go across to the sort of in-house, but it's different, right? Because when you work with solely PRs, it's very different to when you're just one sector within a big business.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I've often been the in-house person, so yes, I get that kind of setup, and it's you've got lots more things to kind of push against, and you have a voice, but again, it's all about the top down and what they kind of want for the business and what their vision is for the business. So yeah, absolutely. But you named some good agencies there. So I think Manifest are doing some great stuff, and Ketchum have been doing some great stuff.
I mean, both sort of Alex and Joanne at Ketchum and Alex at Manifest, they are the leaders at the top that have put the commitment in. And actually it's, I think there are some agencies that maybe do stuff because they think they have to tick boxes and it looks good. But, they do stuff because they want to, they genuinely believe it. And I think when you have leaders like that at the top that do want to do good work and do want to make their work environments
makes all the difference.
And set standards. And what I've noticed more and more through judging actually is that when you have agencies like that set a good example, more and more agencies want to sort of follow suit. Yeah. So even if they don't necessarily, think about it or, whatever the reasons, they kind of don't want to be left behind.
Yeah.
So that's why I have so much admiration for them, because they kind of did it when no one was really
pushing them to do it like that. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, it's so true. You do see it through judging. I haven't done any, I've got some PRCA judging to do later on this year, but I used to do quite a lot of CRPR ones, and you do see a difference in the diversity. When it comes to diversity, I've seen a lot more effort put into those sort of categories and things like that now. So it's interesting. It is true. And flexible working, and there's no more excuses. You can't just use the same excuse now. Post pandemic, I feel like people are changing, the way they kind of work. So very interesting.
Yeah, and thinking about parents and sort of things like sort of bonuses and like pension schemes. I remember, working for a PR agency, getting a sort of pension was like unheard of. And so people and agencies are starting to think more about sort of treating and putting their people first. I think that's really important.
They should, absolutely. Without employees, you have nothing. Yeah. Without employees, there is no business. So I think it's so important that people prioritize their employees. So important. So what key lessons would you say you've learned throughout your career? If you could name maybe like 3 key things you've learned throughout your career that you could maybe pass on. So in a sense of with the hat on of giving advice to young people of colour considering entering the industry as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a big fan of mentoring. So I always think, look for someone that you admire or emulate. It doesn't always have to be someone, in the same field of you as you, and try and learn as much as you can. I think you need to be really focused. So I always work with my mentees and we set a bit of a strategy. So you treat it the same way that you would treat a campaign, put together a clear strategy and goals. And I think that, when you're focused, when you know where you want to end up, then you're more likely to be successful. So you must have that sort of clear focus. And I think the third thing is, and this is one thing that I think is really important, is go through, doesn't matter whether you're an AE or a sort of director of comms, treat people around you sort of respectfully and be a nice person. I think sometimes people think that to be successful, you kind of have to be cutthroat. You don't have to be. No. I think, you need to be strong, definitely. Yeah. But I think you need to be a nice person, because I think it comes back to haunt you otherwise.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And that's been kind of the consensus for today, being respectful and being nice is quite interesting, because the same thing, we had the same sort of answer from the person I've interviewed before.
And also giving back as well.
Giving back is important.
Learning that once you do get to a certain level, it's almost a responsibility to be able to want to give back.
Yeah.
And to help.
That's what I admire about you, though, because you do a lot to, for the industry. Because obviously I met you through Women in PR, because I was on the board there, and you came and spoke at one of our events, which is great. And but I love that you do give back, and that's something that I admire about you, because there are other people that I know of in the industry who, to me, it seems like they get to a certain level and then just pull the ladder up. They're like, pull the ladder up, no more thanks. And it's like, wow, what are we doing here? So no, it's much appreciated.
But it's really important, though. I mean, the thing that I realised as soon as I first became a communications director, I always knew in my mind that I would try and use my position of power to make a difference. And so things like I said, being the person who instructs the recruitment agency to send me through CVs.
Yeah.
I want to be able to help nurture talent. Like the thing that we did at Hearst for people who wanted to get into publishing or luxury, that was kind of like the first thing within our sector for us to do, because you really do want to make sure that people are coming through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really helpful. I'm wrapping up now. So lastly, mindset. So how do you deal with this sort of internal mindset war? How do you manage self-limiting beliefs?
Everyone always talks about imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
I've always heard that so much. And like people say, I don't think I've ever had that. And I don't know, I don't know what it is, but I think, like I said to you, I've always had it within me that I've always been so focused, and I've always believed that whatever I want to achieve, I can do it. And it's not sort of, I realize that it's challenging, and I always realize that it's going to be sort of hard work, but I don't know, it's that self-belief. It's like I've got something in me where I kind of, even when it's like I feel like I'm at my lowest, I dig deep. And I dig deep, and I know that I can rely on myself to kind of push myself through. I think it's, it's like, I don't know if it's like the African in me, but it's that resilience. So yeah.
Determination. No, that's brilliant.
Determination, ambition. Yeah.
And
wanting to do well, wanting to be the best, wanting to do well, wanting to do good work, wanting to be able to give back. That's what's always motivated me.
No, I can understand that. That makes sense. And it's interesting that you never experienced the imposter syndrome. And they talk about that a lot in our industry. They speak about that a lot in our industry.
I get that people have it, but it also frustrates me as well, because that in itself is a self-limiting belief.
It is.
No, it's almost like people are being conditioned to think that if you do well, you're an imposter of some sorts. How about you do well because you deserve it?
Because you deserve it. Absolutely.
You're actually genuinely good at your job.
At what you do. Absolutely. Exactly. I'm kind of more from your kind of school. I feel like I'm a bit more confident in that sense. And I always think I can go for whatever, and I can do whatever comes my way. I feel like we are limitless. We can do whatever we put our mind to, and I think that's important to try and keep with you as you kind of progress. So yeah, absolutely. I'm all with you on that one. And looking back on your journey, would you do it all over again?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I'd had an easier ride. I'm not going to lie, but would I change anything? No, because I think even things that have been sort of really tough and hard, and there have been lots of instances throughout my career when things really have been awful and tough and hard and soul destroying. I always think out of all of those scenarios, there's always something better that's happened from it, and you always grow as a person.
Yeah.
So like even getting into PR, it's because the job that I had to be a political reporter for the BBC fell through.
Right.
But if that had come through, I wouldn't be in PR, and I wouldn't be in the position that I am now.
Yeah.
So it's almost like out of every disappointment comes a blessing.
Absolutely. And my mum says that every disappointment has a purpose. You know, you think, oh, really? You think it actually does make sense.
Yeah.
It really does. It really does. And what would you say is maybe the best or worst advice you've been given? This can be funny. Sometimes the worst advice are funny. Sometimes the best advice are great.
I mean, the best advice actually was one of my first MDs. He always said it was like PR and not ER. So he always used to say to me, like, unless, someone's died or something's happened, and sometimes that does happen in PR, it's like, it can wait.
Yeah.
Like, you don't work yourself into the ground. Wait.
Yeah.
And that's something
I like that.
I've always thought, I always say to my teams that unless, it's literally a matter of life or death, leave it until tomorrow.
Yeah.
That's something I've carried through, from however long ago it was I worked with him, like 12 years ago or something. I've always carried that ethos too, because otherwise I think you always get wrapped up in thinking
You
that
really do.
it's life or death. It's only PR. You're not saving lives. You're not in, the NHS or something.
Yeah.
The worst piece of advice? I don't know. I can't think of it.
Probably wouldn't hold on to it anyway. You would have let that go. Ideally.
I can't actually think of everything, because I always think sometimes like you have to take different bits of advice and they could be applicable to you, but they could be more applicable to someone else. So even if it's bad advice for you, it might be good advice for someone else.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, I always say you pick out the good bits, what makes sense, leave the rest, really. I think that's the best way to do it. And then lastly, do you have any rules that you've implemented, to help yourself along your career journey? Any rules that you stick by, like, for progression or anything?
Yeah, so it's the focus. It's the focus of knowing what I want to do, what I want to achieve, knowing, what kind of, even though in some ways, some of my career, and I wouldn't say I've ever been surprised in my career. I've always had a definite, I want to work for this brand or I want to do this role, and I followed through with it. So, I don't know.
That's good though. That in itself is what you said. What you just said is quite key. So you've always focused on what you wanted to do.
I've always had a plan. I think that's
planned, and you've kind of followed through your plan.
I've always had a plan, and I will always have a plan. And even, I guess, when people don't agree with my plan or think I'm kind of, I'm taking a risk or doing something, whatever, I always know in myself that this is what's best for me. And I think you always have to use that inner judgment to know that you're the person that faces the consequence of any decision.
Yeah.
And so any decisions you make have to be the best decisions for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That was, and you've just, rounded that off really lovely, really nicely. That was really great. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful speaking with you and learning about your journey, your experience. It's been absolutely insightful. And you guys listening, if you want to connect with Effie, you can do that on LinkedIn. Effie, do you want to give some of your details for connecting? Sorry. If anyone wants to connect with you.
I'm just under Effie Kanyua on LinkedIn.
Okay.
So, yeah.
There you go.
I think so. I'm always really bad with my social media handles because I always forget what they are.
Because you're too busy doing it for your brands. That's why, we always, you've got about our brands, you get our own ones. But no, thank you so much.
That's the weird thing about PRs. They're very bad at self-promotion.
Yes.
They're always promoting other people. But
LinkedIn. Okay, you can find Effie on LinkedIn. And that's so true. We are definitely bad at promoting ourselves, which is so funny. We spend our whole life doing it for other people. But yes, thank you so much for sharing, guys. Stay tuned. I will be back with more guests as always. Hope you guys have a blessed time until then, because we'll be back with some more great comm professionals. So thanks again.